Peter Navarro is a very close aide of Donald Trump. He was somebody who, particularly after the 2020 election, stood by Trump's side, played a major role in advising Donald Trump about how to navigate the post-2020 election. As a result, he was someone who became high up on the public enemies list of the political establishment in Washington. He was blamed in a lot of ways as being one of Trump's aides who encouraged him to persist in his view that the 2020 election was the byproduct of election fraud, and as well was somebody who was blamed for agitating and stirring people up in order to in a way that led to the riot on January 6th and to the violence on January 6th. Now, as a result, Peter Navarro is somebody who, if you're an American liberal, if you're in the American political establishment, you absolutely dislike. And that shouldn't matter for the story that we're about to tell you about, but it absolutely and obviously does, which is that Peter Navarro is on his way to prison, where he will serve a real sentence in a real prison of 4 months because he was found guilty of being in contempt of a congressional subpoena. Oftentimes, Congress orders people to appear before it to testify about certain matters that Congress wants to know about. The January 6th committee issued a subpoena directing Peter Navarro to appear before it to answer certain questions. Navarro refused to appear, arguing that the information that the committee was seeking was protected by the executive privilege because he was an advisor to President Trump and was speaking to President Trump in that capacity. And instead of going there and raising that privilege, he simply didn't show up. The Congress found him in contempt of Congress, and he is now on his way to prison. Now, you may think that that's not a big deal. It's only a 4-month prison term. He actually did ignore a congressional subpoena. The important thing to know is that never in the history of our country has anyone gone to prison for contempt of a congressional subpoena until today, when Donald Trump's close political advisor, Peter Navarro, obviously hated by the establishment for the reasons I just said, went to prison, becoming the first ever person to do so, despite the fact that many top officials in Washington, including President Obama's Attorney General Eric Holder, were also found by Congress to be guilty of contempt of a congressional subpoena by failing to comply. And needless to say, they never got anywhere near a prison. This is something reserved exclusively for Peter Navarro. Here's how CNN decided to frame the story. Ex-Trump aide Peter Navarro begins serving prison sentence after historic contempt prosecution. And it is historic. Historic because people don't go to prison for defying a congressional subpoena until now, and unless you are advisor to Donald Trump, who the establishment blames for his post-2020 election conduct. But that can't be how justice is meted out, and yet it is. Quote, Peter Navarro, an ex-White House aide to former President Donald Trump, has reported to a federal prison in Miami, making history as the first former White House official to be imprisoned for a contempt of Congress conviction. Navarro was sentenced to 4 months in prison for his refusal to comply with a subpoena from the House Select Committee that investigated the January 6, 2021 U.S. Capitol attack. For decades, the two branches of government have engaged in a game of chicken over the protections that surround the presidency and how Congress can enforce his subpoena. There have been incentives on both sides to negotiate toward a deal rather than test in court the monumental questions of executive privilege and immunity in court. In this case, the Justice Department, the Biden Justice Department, took the uncommon step, the unprecedented step, of prosecuting a former White House advisor for blowing off a congressional subpoena at Congress's prompting after holding Navarro in criminal contempt and referring him to the Department of Justice. Now remember, Democrats, since 2016, have depicted themselves as the defender and guardians of American political norms and traditions. The defenders of an apolitical justice system and of an independent Department of Justice. And yet, over and over, what we see is the application of novel legal theories to punish Donald Trump's followers, as happened all throughout January 6th and those prosecutions, when they found ways to convert non-violent political protest, which according to the government was true for the vast majority of people prosecuting in connection with January 6th, that they did not use violence. They found a way to convert that into a felony using never before highly innovative precedents and interpretations of law that are now actually starting to be weakened by courts the more they look at them. But obviously it extends as well to the fact that Donald Trump, if the Democrats get their way, will be the first ever American president to see the inside of a jail cell. They tried to strike him from the ballot. This is all what is called lawfare, the abuse of the legal system, of the judicial system, to punish people for political ends. Now, here from the Hill in June of 2022 was an article by Jonathan Turley called Subpoena Wars, Washington is on a Path to Mutually Assured Destruction. And here is Jonathan Turley's argument that he made in 2022 about all this. Quote, Attorney General Merrick Garland is well on his way to setting a record for the prosecution of congressional contempt. The Justice Department has consistently refused to submit congressional contempt cases to grand juries, including a flagrant act of contempt by Obama-era Attorney General Eric Holder. There is ample basis for this charge as well. It is not the substance, but the selectivity and speed of the charges that is notable. Navarro was only held in contempt in April and is now being prosecuted by a department long known as the place where contempt sanctions go to die. Now, there are important reasons why it is highly unusual, in fact, unprecedented for officials of the executive branch who work for the president not to be put into prison for defying congressional subpoenas. There are obvious issues of checks and balances and the always ongoing quest for power between the various branches of government. If you're an ordinary citizen and you defy a congressional subpoena, then you very well may end up in prison. That has happened before. People who lie to Congress, people who defy Congress might end up in prison. But when you have members of the executive branch who are being told by members of Congress that they're forced to do something or go to prison, that creates all kinds of separation of power issues about what the ability of Congress is to force members of the executive branch, an Article 1 body in Congress telling an Article 2 body, the executive branch, that they have to comply with congressional subpoenas or go to prison. And that's why in Washington the norm has always been that even if a member of the executive branch refuses or fails to comply with a congressional subpoena, they do not go to prison because the Justice Department never wanted to test this. All of this is brand new. It's newly minted for Donald Trump and his advisors, yet again. If there had been a history of executive branch officials who were found to be in contempt of Congress going to prison, and then Peter Navarro was sent to prison in accordance with that precedent, I would have nothing to say about this case. But it's the fact that, as always, there's a complete deviation from principles and tradition and precedent to politicize the justice system, to warp and weaponize it in service of the attempt by the Washington establishment, including members of both political parties, to keep out of power any political movement that threatens its orthodoxies. Here from CNN in February of 2008, Attorney General declines to investigate Bush advisors. U.S. Attorney General Michael Mukasey Friday said he will not ask the federal grand jury to investigate whether two top Bush administration officials should be prosecuted for contempt of Congress. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi Thursday asked Mukasey to look into whether White House Chief of Staff Josh Bolten and former White House counsel Harriet Miers committed contempt of Congress in the investigation of the 2006 firing of several U.S. attorneys. Earlier this month, the House voted to find Bolten and Miers in contempt of Congress and pursue charges against them. The White House argues that forcing the aides to testify would violate the Constitution's separation of powers. So that was the Bush administration refusing to make available top White House officials to Congress in response to a subpoena. The Congress found them in contempt of the subpoena, and the Justice Department said, we're not going to prosecute because it raises separation of powers issues. Here from CNN in July 2012, that was the Obama administration, no criminal prosecution of Eric Holder for contempt. Quote, legal experts noted this week in the run-up to Thursday's House vote that President Barack Obama's assertion of executive privilege in the case would prevent a criminal prosecution under a practice dating to the Reagan administration. Obama asserted executive privilege on some documents sought by Congressman Darrell Issa's committee in its investigation of Operation Fast and Furious. The executive privilege assertion prevented the documents from being turned over on the grounds that they include internal deliberations traditionally protected from outside eyes. This is what I think is the key point about everything that's been happening in the Trump era, which obviously is something that continues to today. The establishment forces in Washington united to warn that Donald Trump presents a wide range of dangers to American democracy. And yet, so often, those dangers have been ushered in not by Donald Trump and his movement, but by the union of establishment forces that have united in the name of protecting American norms. They're the ones who destroy American norms. They're the ones who weaponize the justice system. These are the people who keep saying earnestly, by looking into the camera with a straight face, we have to imprison Donald Trump before the election, because if we don't, he may win and then weaponize the Justice Department against his political enemies. And they have no conception of the obvious internal contradiction within that decree. And here you have a tradition that has been maintained throughout administrations, presidents of both parties, under the control of both parties in Congress, which is that executive branch officials don't go to prison, don't get prosecuted for contempt of court, a precedent, a tradition, a norm that has been destroyed out of an eagerness to send to prison one of Donald Trump's aides, Peter Navarro, for doing something contempt of a congressional subpoena that in Washington has been regarded as not even a prosecutable offense, let alone one warranting prison for decades. And all of that yet again gets tossed away in the name of stopping Donald Trump. And that, more than anything, is the prevailing ethos in Washington, which is that there are no rules of ethics in journalism or politics. There are no tradition or norms that are worth preserving. Everything is justified if the ultimate goal is weakening or punishing or stopping the Trump movement. And for that reason, the real dangers come not from the Trump movement, but from the array of establishment forces aligned against him. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.